before we delve into this bizarre, unsettling Hollywood tragedy. A case where celebrity, secrecy, and murder converged in a single hotel room. If you want to join us in exploring the most complex and unsettling crimes that expose the dark side of fame, hit that subscribe button now. Your support allows us to conduct these deep, immersive investigations. The face was one of the most recognizable on American television. It was the face of Colonel Robert Hogan, witty, charming, eternally resourceful. The brilliant prisoner of war who outsmarted the Nazis every single week. This was Bob Crane, the star of the massive 1960s sitcom, Hogan's Heroes. For millions, Crane represented the image of the clean-cut, likable suburban dad, the perfect 1960s television hero. But the public persona was a meticulously constructed facade, a brilliant lie that concealed a dark, compulsive, and escalating double life. This is the story of the unsolved murder of Bob Crane, a tragedy that took place in a mundane hotel room, fueled by shame, obsession, and the ultimate destructive friendship. It is a true crime mystery rooted in Hollywood's deepest secrets, where the man who charmed America was stalked by the darkness he himself had invited. To understand the assassination, you must understand the two Bobs. The first Bob, the public figure. He was a radio personality turned television star. He was married, a father, deeply professional on set, and celebrated by the network as a dependable, non-controversial lead. This Bob Crane was the image of American stability. The second Bob, the secret, compulsive addict. Behind the scenes, Crane was sinking into a deep, disturbing obsession with sex and technology. His fixation was not merely casual infidelity. It was a compulsive drive to capture and document his encounters, often with multiple partners, using the latest photographic and video equipment. This second life began, innocently enough, as a shared hobby with his best friend, John Henry Carpenter. John Carpenter was a low-level electronics salesman with a fascination for photographic equipment and a knack for video technology. Carpenter was introduced to Crane through the television industry, as Crane frequently purchased the latest gadgets. They were an unlikely pairing, the major television star and the quiet, slightly awkward technician. But Carpenter quickly became more than just a friend. He became Crane's enabler and confidant. Carpenter began traveling with Crane everywhere, acting as his technological assistant, setting up the complex video equipment used to film their shared sexual exploits. For Crane, Carpenter provided the means to feed his technological compulsion. For Carpenter, Crane provided the key to a glamorous, illicit lifestyle he could never have attained on his own. Their relationship was intensely codependent and defined by the dark secret they shared. When Hogan's Heroes ended in 1971, Crane found himself in the common Hollywood bind, typecasting. Unable to secure another major television role, his career stalled. His first marriage collapsed under the weight of his secret life. He quickly married his co-star, Patricia Olson, who played Colonel Klink's secretary, Hilda, on the show, but his compulsion did not slow down. To maintain his lifestyle and income, Crane was relegated to the dinner theater circuit, a grueling, low-glamour schedule of touring in small stage productions across the country, often performing in plays like Beginner's Luck. By the summer of 1978, Bob Crane was performing in Scottsdale, Arizona, having a play called The Love Nest. He was staying at the Winfield Place Apartments, a modest, temporary residence typical of the dinner theater circuit. His career was fading, His compulsive life was escalating, and his constant, manipulative demands on Carpenter, who had traveled with him to Scottsdale, were reaching a breaking point. The dark truth of his life was about to violently collide with the facade of his television image, and the consequences would be final. Scottsdale, in the summer of 1978, was a place of fading dreams for Bob Crane. He was no longer the charming Colonel Hogan. He was a desperate, demanding figure clinging to the remnants of his fame. The stress of the dinner theater circuit, performing 8 shows a week to small, often apathetic audiences, was grinding him down. The critical relationship during this period was his increasingly strained, intensely volatile partnership with John Henry Carpenter. Carpenter was no longer just the assistant. He was the key keeper to Crane's secret life. He handled the equipment, helped set up the liaisons, and was constantly present, a strange, shadow figure in Crane's life. But the arrangement was failing. Crane was financially drained, often leaving Carpenter to cover expenses, and his manipulative demands were becoming excessive. On the afternoon of June 28, 1978, the final day of Crane's run in Scottsdale, the tension between the two men was palpable. Crane was preparing to leave Arizona and was making final demands of Carpenter to arrange one last, elaborate session before his departure. Crane's wife, Patricia, who was not in Scottsdale, had reportedly given Crane an ultimatum. Either he commit to their marriage and stop his destructive behavior, or she would leave him. This external pressure only heightened Crane's internal frenzy and his demands on Carpenter. The final known sequence of events unfolded primarily between the hotel room at Winfield Place and the local bar. Crane and Carpenter spent the afternoon drinking heavily. Crane was making phone calls, arranging his departure, and, most crucially, attempting to set up a liaison with a local woman who was also performing on the circuit. Carpenter was performing his usual role, but sources later noted his growing, quiet resentment. The relationship had fundamentally shifted from friendship into a destructive, codependent rivalry. Carpenter was not simply enabling Crane, he was now a direct participant in the lifestyle, and he was being treated, financially and personally, as disposable. Carpenter wanted the glamour, but he was receiving only the degradation and the bill. Sometime after the play's final performance that evening, Crane and Carpenter returned to the apartment. The exact sequence of events that occurred inside apartment 132 has never been conclusively established, and it remains the central, silent moment of the mystery. The generally accepted timeline suggests that at some point late on the night of June 28th or early in the morning of June 29th, the argument, the financial pressure, and the years of shared, dark secrets erupted into a violent confrontation. The struggle was not loud enough to alert neighbors in the modest apartment complex. The violence was quick, silent, and overwhelmingly brutal, suggesting the confrontation was initiated suddenly and decisively. The weapon used was not a firearm, nor was it the knife often associated with celebrity crime. The weapon was a piece of heavy camera equipment, a tripod or a stand, a chilling metaphor for the instrument that had facilitated their dark bond for years. The scene of the murder, as later discovered by police, would speak volumes about the killer's intense, personal rage, far exceeding the violence necessary for simple murder. The discovery was made on the morning of June 29, 1978, when Bob Crane failed to show up for a luncheon engagement with his co-star, Victoria Berry. Concerned, Berry contacted Bob Crane's manager, who drove immediately to the Winfield Place apartments. The manager used a spare key to enter apartment 132. The scene inside was immediately horrific. Bob Crane was found dead in his bed. He had been brutally bludgeoned. The cause of death was determined to be massive, blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted with overwhelming force, suggesting a prolonged, intense outburst of personal hatred. The scene was immediately baffling to the initial police responders. The room showed signs of a brief struggle, but the overall presentation was messy and confusing. The immediate investigative failures would become the enduring hallmark of the case. The investigative failures. Scene contamination. The local Scottsdale Police Department, unequipped for a celebrity murder of this magnitude, failed to properly secure the scene initially. Several people, including the manager and responding officers, contaminated the area, potentially destroying crucial trace evidence. Lack of forensic focus. The prime theory was initially a robbery gone wrong, despite the lack of forced entry and the highly personal nature of the bludgeoning. This led to a failure to immediately focus on the complex interpersonal dynamics that defined Crane's final days. The missing weapon. The presumed murder weapon, a piece of tripod or heavy metal stand, was missing from the apartment, further complicating the immediate evidence collection. However, a few critical pieces of evidence were collected that immediately shifted the focus from a random crime to an intimate, internal confrontation. First, seminal fluid was found on the sheets, indicating that sexual activity had occurred shortly before or during the time of the murder. This immediately pointed the investigation back to Crane's compulsive lifestyle and his partner's. Second, the discovery of a blood smear on the bathroom door was crucial. The smear was not Crane's. It suggested that the killer was injured during the violent struggle. The police initially failed to adequately collect and preserve this blood sample. Another catastrophic error that would haunt the case for decades. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the last person known to have been with Bob Crane, John Henry Carpenter. Carpenter was located and questioned. He claimed that he and Crane had spent the night together, but that he had left Crane alive in the early hours of June 29th to drive to the airport for an early flight back to California. The police were immediately suspicious of Carpenter's calm demeanor and his convenient departure. They executed a search warrant on Carpenter's flight bag but found no evidence linking him directly to the murder. Carpenter admitted that he and Crane had argued over money and Crane's demanding nature, but vehemently denied killing his friend. Without a murder weapon, a clean crime scene, or strong direct evidence, the police had no choice but to release John Carpenter. The case, defined by its Hollywood shock value and its disastrous investigative start, quickly stalled, becoming one of the most frustrating celebrity cold cases in history. The murder of Bob Crane went officially unsolved for over a decade and a half, defined by the relentless, singular focus of the police on John Henry Carpenter. The key figure in the sustained pursuit of justice was Detective Barry King, who was assigned to the cold case file years after the initial murder. Detective King refused to believe the crime was random. He meticulously rebuilt the case, concentrating on the codependent, explosive relationship between Crane and Carpenter. Detective King's theory was simple. Carpenter was motivated by a mixture of resentment and shame. He was tired of being treated as Crane's servant, and he was tired of carrying the weight of Crane's humiliating secrets. The breaking point, King theorized, was Crane's final, manipulative demand for a sexual liaison before leaving town, coupled with the realization that Crane was about to cut Carpenter loose completely. The blunt object, the camera equipment, was a symbolic weapon, destroying the man and the apparatus that had facilitated his own degradation. The lack of early evidence was the greatest obstacle. However, in the 1990s, the emergence of DNA technology finally offered a breakthrough. Detective King managed to convince the authorities to re-examine the tiny, forgotten blood smear collected from the bathroom door of apartment 132 in 1978. The blood sample, though small and poorly preserved, was analyzed. The analysis revealed that the blood was indeed not Bob Crane's. Furthermore, the analysis produced a genetic profile that was consistent with the blood of John Henry Carpenter. This was the first true piece of physical evidence linking Carpenter to the crime scene. Armed with this, and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence regarding the motive and his presence, the authorities finally secured an arrest warrant for John Henry Carpenter in 1992, 14 years after the murder. The trial, held in 1994, became a national sensation. The defense, however, immediately attacked the quality of the evidence, pointing directly to the abysmal state of the 1978 investigation. The defense argued contamination. The blood sample was so poorly collected and preserved that contamination over the 14 years was a certainty, rendering the DNA analysis unreliable. Inconclusive DNA. The technology used was not conclusive enough to definitively state the blood was Carpenter's, only that it was consistent with his profile. Reasonable doubt. Carpenter was Crane's best friend and technical assistant. It was entirely possible, even likely, that his blood could have been in the apartment from a minor cut or scrape unrelated to the murder. The defense was devastatingly effective, exploiting every single failure of the 1978 Scottsdale Police Department. The jury was left with agonizing, irreconcilable doubt. In 1995, John Henry Carpenter was acquitted of the murder of Bob Crane. He walked free, though his name remained inextricably linked to the dark secrets and the unsolved murder of his famous friend until his death in 2011. The acquittal of John Henry Carpenter ensured that the murder of Bob Crane remains officially unsolved, becoming a permanent Hollywood ghost story defined by secrecy and failure. The enduring consensus among investigators and true crime enthusiasts remains that John Carpenter was the killer, driven by the violent intersection of shame, financial resentment, and the compulsion that defined their partnership. However, the legal system required definitive proof, and the early investigative failures ensured that proof was permanently corrupted. The legacy of Bob Crane is a tragic duality. He is remembered as the quick-witted, charming Colonel Hogan, but his life and death are now inextricably tied to the dark, compulsive addiction that consumed him. The secrecy he cultivated, the videos, the liaisons, the desperate need for documentation, became the very elements that fueled his destruction and ultimately masked the final truth of his killer. The ultimate tragedy is that the secrecy Crane so desperately maintained was only exposed because of his brutal murder. His life became a cautionary tale about the immense gap between the public facade of celebrity and the private turmoil that can define a person's existence. The murder weapon was never recovered. The full details of the confrontation were never revealed. The truth remained sealed within the walls of apartment 132, a silent witness to the final, violent act of a destructive, codependent friendship. The unsolved case of Bob Crane is a permanent reminder that some of the most compelling crimes are not solved by technological breakthroughs, but are instead lost forever in the avoidable, mundane errors of a failed investigation. The killer walked free, protected not by brilliance, but by the devastating incompetence of the initial moments after the crime.